A BC man says he feels humiliated after WestJet kicked him off a flight to Cuba and left him and his family stranded at Toronto's airport. Stephen Bennett, who recently suffered a stroke, was told to leave after he took a sleeping pill and fell into a deep sleep before takeoff. Joining us now for reaction is air passenger rights advocate Gabor Lukacs. Hello, Gabor.
Good afternoon. Good evening.
Can you tell us what was your reaction when you heard about this situation?
I was appalled, disappointed, horrified that an airline in Canada in 2018 would treat a passenger this way. It was unjustifiable, unwarranted, senseless.
Is this something you've heard of before happening in Canada?
I've heard rare cases when passengers were removed from flight without reason. Unfortunately, it's not the only case. Perhaps the most interesting case relating to Canadian airline was an Air Canada flight from India to Canada, where a whole family was removed by Air Canada because their daughter got sick. She threw up because of the smell in the toilet, not because she had any medical problem. And the airline just left the passenger stranded there. The courts in India ordered Air Canada to pay over $60,000.
Wow. So in this case, does WestJet have any right to say if there was an emergency, this passenger may have not responded, may have not been able to wake up and us move him safely? Do they have a right to do this?
I have very little faith in such arguments. Let me explain to you why. We do have passengers with disabilities. So if this argument were accepted, if this were to fly, then by the same token, WestJet could argue that they don't want to transport anybody who has a disability, which is completely unacceptable. We do have passengers who are wheelchair bound, and yes, in the case of an emergency, they may need more assistance. That is the duty to accommodate. They have an obligation to accommodate passengers with disabilities up to the point of hardship, and clearly, just because someone is bound to a wheelchair, that's not a reason to prevent them from flying.
Okay, now you actually spoke with Mr. Bennett. What does he say? What has he told you?
I spoke to him only very briefly because I'm waiting now to receive more documents. I would like to see what exactly happened. What I do know, based on what I've heard and what I read, is that he was treated very, very poorly. He felt humiliated. And he has every right to seek compensation from WestJet for the damage they caused. He incurred out-of-pocket expenses. He had to buy an Air Canada ticket to get to his destination. He also suffered damages by losing part of his vacation and, of course, injury to his self-esteem. Clearly, doing something like this in public carries an additional consequence, and the WestJet, I hope, will have to pay for that.
Yeah, now, is it correct, I don't know if you know this, but WestJet had removed him from the plane after finding that he had fallen asleep. And again, he had just suffered a stroke in a recent time. So he was going on vacation, potentially just to get better. Is it possible that they maybe treated him differently because he came onto the plane and then had to take the pill? And I understand, was he in a wheelchair?
I'm still working on finding out what exactly his situation was. If his disability played any role in how he was treated, which is certainly a possibility, it is way worse for WestJet, because then it was not simply making a bad decision based on flawed training, but rather it was discriminating then against the passenger with disabilities. Just because somebody falls asleep as a result of sleeping pill, that is not a reason to remove a passenger from the flight. That is unjustifiable, unwarranted. If you do it to someone because they have a disability, even though there is medical data showing that they are fit to fly, then you're quite clearly discriminating against someone because of their disability. What WestJet is doing now is they are doubling down and they are claiming this is indeed our policy, which suggests that this was not simply a discrimination, but possibly a reckless or willful discrimination, which has even bigger consequences. So I'm struggling to understand why WestJet is doing all this. If it were up to me, WestJet should apologize, compensate the passenger, learn from it, and move on. Instead, what we are seeing is a complete media disaster, a PR disaster for WestJet, and people are now saying that they will not be flying with WestJet because of this, and they are right to feel that way. I would not want to fly with an airline that treats fellow passengers, especially passengers with a disability, this way.
So what recourse does Mr. Bennett have now? Can he demand his money back? Because they said you have to get off the plane and you can get on the next flight, but the next flight was a week away, and so we had to go on Air Canada, correct?
That's correct. WestJet should have, at the very least, after discovering their error, put Mr. Bennett and his family on the next available flight of any airline. In that case, it would be Air Canada. So the fact that Mr. Bennett had to go out and buy a ticket on his own already puts WestJet into a very bad situation. They had no reason to remove him from the flight, and when they did it, they didn't do what they were supposed to do, which is get to him to his destination as soon as possible. In terms of recourses, Mr. Bennett can certainly sue in court, not only for his expenses, but also for the treatment he received, the humiliation. And the other avenue is, if indeed this is an issue of disability, then he can also file a complaint with the Canadian Human Rights Commission and go to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, because it may have been, and we are still working on finding out, that the reason that his mistreatment was tied into his disability, and that is certainly something which is prohibited under the Canadian Human Rights Act.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. We'll keep up with you and see what happens in all of this. That is air passenger rights advocate Gabor Lukacs. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.